I started the Impact Collective. It might sound cliche, but I started the Impact Collective after George Floyd was murdered. I am a white person who benefits from multi-generational wealth that was generated by my grandfather. And I live in a very affluent white community in Boston. And I just got the sense that there was more that I could be doing personally and more that the majority of the people in my community could be doing as well. So I really built it with that foundation of just feeling like enough is enough, and we're not doing what we could be doing to really change the world that we're living in. I had had a really incredible series of opportunities to work as a board member in nonprofits that work in the educational access space and in the race equity space. And so I had already been having an education as a white person and some proximity as a white person that I think the majority of white Americans don't necessarily have. And so I had come into the summer of 2020 with a front row seat to race relations in the US and to the impact of systemic racism and economic racism. So that was sort of the backdrop. And then for me, that summer was a summer of isolation and also sort of a summer of suspension where things were very locked down in the Northeast. And it gave me the space, I think, to be reflective and internally focused in a way that just the busyness of life before COVID, it didn't allow. And so I think it was the perfect conditions for me before the brutal murder of George Floyd to be able to be in a space of introspection and then an outrage. And so I think it was a sort of this unique combination of this moment of calm because I wasn't in the busyness of parenting and schooling and activities and all of the things that keep us, I think, distracted from what's really happening in the country. And I think that really allowed me to be catalyzed and activated in a way that I hadn't been before. So the Impact Collective is designed to reduce the racial wealth gap. We're really interested in economic inclusion. And the way that we do that is we have a couple of different programs. Our flagship program is an intensive, in-depth workshop designed for wealthy white women. I started where I am, which is as a wealthy white woman, wanting to work with women that I really understand and know really well. And we also have an adaptation of that workshop, which is designed for mixed race groups, more mixed income groups. And the goal of both workshops is to educate and activate people to align their wealth to their values. And we're talking about all aspects of wealth. So we're talking about spending, we're talking about investing, we're talking about banking, and we're talking about giving, which a lot of people are already comfortable doing. They're very comfortable in philanthropy. And we're also talking about voting. Wealthy white women occupy a really unique space in the financial landscape and also the cultural and social landscape of the US. And so we have a really unique opportunity, and in my mind, a really unique responsibility. Wealthy white women, for the most part, are the most proximate members of our society to wealthy white men, who are the most powerful members of our society at this point. Wealthy white women are also the keepers of the culture in white society as parents to white children. Of course, there are plenty of white folks in the States that are married to people of color and in mixed race marriages with mixed race children. So it's not purely homogeneous. But wealthy white women with their influence and affluence have a really unique opportunity to sort of strategically lever their spheres of influence. I think there is a spectrum of racial awareness for people of all races, right? There's a developmental arc. And I think I had moved into the ally space from pure bystander into ally. And I think the murder of George Floyd actually moved me into the activist space. So I think I went beyond being an ally because I was truly activated to organize in my own community and activate everyone else in that community as well. But I think part of what happens for whites in America is that we are told that it isn't our job to fix systemic racism. I think that a lot of what we read puts the onus and the responsibility on the people who've been marginalized. And I have discovered this in looking into what are some actions that asset owners in the United States can take to impact the racial wealth gap. It's not out there yet. We're working on building that right now, because if you read all of the leading literature and research on the racial wealth gap, it talks about what the people who've been marginalized and excluded from our economy should do. They need more education. They should seek more education. They should have bolder conversations. They should get promoted. And what is left out is, who are the people in power that we're holding responsible, and what are the actions that they should be taking to change the system? For me, allyship really means that I need to be organizing in my own community. So I need to be learning with, planning, and taking action together with other wealthy white Americans or other white Americans, without asking our colleagues and our peers and our friends and family members of color to educate us. So I need to take the responsibility to understand what's happening here without putting that onus on the people of color that are in my life. That's the first thing. You really can be an ally in that way. And it's really important to not work in isolation. So it's really important to be listening to and guided by the voices of people of color. And for me, it's really important to listen to women of color in particular, to take the actions that they believe that I should be taking or that we need to be taking. And then the other, I think, really important role that white allies can play is calling out, challenging, and actually dismantling white supremacy culture and the patriarchy with all of the tools that I have at my disposal, which is where you get into the question of wealthy Americans, in particular, wealthy white Americans have different tools than white Americans that don't have multi-generational or very significant wealth. And so we have influence and affluence that we can leverage to dismantle white supremacy culture and the patriarchy. And we have organizing skills and communities and networks that we can bring together and leverage to do that as well. And we importantly have proximity to white men in positions of power. And for me personally, I've built a lot of relationships just over my life with white men who trust me, with whom I can have different conversations as an ally about the realities that are playing out every day and what their role is. And in order to be an ally, I have to have those conversations, even when they're really uncomfortable. Mindset shift is the precursor to all of the other changes that we want to see. And so, when I think about how do we change the systems that we're living and operating in, we talk about systems change at the Impact Collective a lot. And three of the really key changes that have to happen are policies, programs, and practices, not to mention resource flow and power dynamic. And if in order for those things to change, the mindsets have to change of the people in power. And so before we can actually get the changes to happen that are going to allow the players to shift and the policies to shift, we need to start with the mindsets shifting. And that's very hard work, but we're ready for it. The first and most critical aha moment is personalizing my role in the racial wealth gap. So what people that have more assets than the average American need to understand is that today I am participating in increasing the racial wealth gap if I'm not doing anything to stop it. And so that's the first and most important realization that people need to have, is that this isn't about slavery and my ability to say, oh, my ancestors weren't here during slavery, so it's not, I'm not responsible for what's happening in the US, or my ancestors weren't here even during sharecropping. So I can't be responsible for that. What we need to do is shift and understand that everybody who is part of the financial system, which is everybody in the US, but in particular, asset owners, so those that have more capital than the average American, have a different amount of responsibility for what we're seeing in terms of economic exclusion. And I need to internalize that before I can do anything else.
Do you see that that internalization as something that is really tough for a lot of the people who that you're engaging?
Yeah, it's really hard because it challenges really fundamental American mythology that we all have internalized our entire lives. And so the bootstrap narrative of people's grandparents pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, if you were white in America, you actually don't have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps because there are a lot of policies in place, federal, state, and local policies that are going to help you pull your bootstraps up. And so you have to have a reckoning with what you have been told and what you've told yourself about how you got to where you are. Or maybe it's your spouse who brought money to the table, how your spouse got to where they are, or how your grandfather, amassed the wealth that he had, or any number of wealth accumulation touch points that wealthy Americans and wealthy white Americans in particular have in their family narratives really need to be reexamined. And that's hard to do.